Hello, I'm Emma McCrea and I'll be your host for today's episode of the Brighter Thinking Pod, brought to you by Cambridge University Press. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our primary special episode. We're going to be focusing on some of the key topics relating to primary education, from teaching techniques to bringing the curriculum to life to the development of key skills including reading, writing and speaking. We hope you find our conversation today useful. Our discussion is also going to touch upon the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically looking at the long-term influence it might have on education. The sudden collision of technology with teaching and learning, resulting in online teaching, live lessons and home learning, has a lot of us thinking about how education will evolve in the future. We're really pleased to welcome two brand new guests to our virtual studio this morning who we hope will be able to bring their unique insights into these areas of discussion. Gill Budgell, a consultant publisher, researcher and writer specialising in early years and primary English language learning. Gill provides support and expertise for publishing in the education sector as well as writing experience with her business Fratempo Ltd. Gill is also the author of Stages 1 and 2 in our new Cambridge Primary English series, as well as our successful long-running handwriting series Pen Pals for Handwriting. Gill, would you mind giving us a quick introduction to Fratempo, your work as an education consultant and author, and your connection to the press?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks very much for inviting me. I started life as an early years teacher and a primary teacher, and then quite quickly developed some additional expertise in working with bilingual pupils and those learning English as an additional language. I've always been interested in developing the very best resources for teachers and pupils. That was my inspiration for setting up Fratempo, because it allows me to work alongside publishers, big and small, to really help me to carry out research, to support them, to work alongside them. And I've absolutely loved doing that over a great many years. Additionally, I'm a primary school governor and I'm a trustee of a multi-academy trust quite locally. So I still get into schools at lots of different levels, both classroom and from an administration point of view as well. So my involvement really in education is long and wide in terms of experience, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Thanks for joining us, Gill. We're also joined by Martin Bailey, Director of Animate to Educate Ltd, Digital Enrichment Leader at Lanchester E.P Primary School in County Durham, and also Lecturer in Primary Computing at Durham University. Martin, good morning to you. I wonder if you can perhaps give us an overview of Animate to Educate and your work as a Digital Enrichment Leader and Lecturer, please.
Thank you, Emma, for the opportunity to be involved in the podcast this morning. So first and foremost, I am a primary school teacher. I have been for 21 years now at various schools in the northeast of England. So currently I'm employed at Lanchester E.P Primary School in County Durham, where I do have this rather glamorous sounding title of Digital Enrichment Leader. And basically I got the opportunity to teach and deliver computing to all year groups from EYFS to year 6 within the school. And also I'm responsible for how technology is embedded across the curriculum in all subjects throughout the school. Within my sort of time as a full-time teacher, I really did enjoy using technology in the classroom, something that I sort of brought from my own personal life, my own personal experiences. That was how the business sort of first started. For a year or two, I was going and doing the workshops in the likes of animation, hence the name of the company, Animate, Educate. And then over the last 8 or 9 years, things have grown, developed, diversified. So I suppose now you would refer to us as a primary computing advisor, primary computing consultant, and as well as doing the pupil workshops, which I still do in schools all over the world. I now do a lot of work directly with staff, doing staff training, inset days, speaking at conferences and courses all over the world. And sort of since last academic year, I've also been delighted to be a lecturer at Durham University, where I deliver the computing element of the training for the BA and PGC students. So it's lovely to have the opportunity now to inspire and to work with the next generation of teachers too.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. Thank you also to our listeners for joining. Do remember that all of the important links and information we discuss in this episode will be included in the show notes if you want to refer to them. And if you want to get in touch with us, please tweet us at CUP Education using the hashtag BrighterPod. We're going to kick off today's episode with a fun question just to get the conversation flowing. So, one of the key themes for the episode is imagination and bringing the curriculum to life. We'd like to ask both of you to cast your minds back to your own experience of learning as a child. What or who inspired your imagination or encouraged you to read or write? Gill, let's start with you.
Yes, I had to think about this because it was a very long time ago. I was a little girl who really liked reading, so that I'm sure will remind people of many children they have in their classrooms. I had a little cubby hole by my bed, and I always had a lot of books lined up in there, and I had a little sort of light that I could put on and a torch. So I used to go under the covers and read when I was supposed to put the light out. I often used to just pick up the dictionary and go through and sort of find words and practice saying them. So yes, quite strange, really. I always loved poetry, and I can actually remember age 8, my teacher, Mrs. Gillett, who was a New Zealander, reading Stig of the Dump. And I really remember loving that and listening and desperate to hear the next episode. And then in terms of writing, because that was obviously reading, I loved writing. And I loved doing handwriting patterns, and I loved filling in little pictures. And I was also very inspired by holidays. We always had big camping holidays, not expensive, but fun. So I would always be encouraged by my mother, who is also incidentally, or was a teacher. So I was always inspired to write a holiday diary. It was my job because my brother wasn't so keen to do it. So I had to do it. And the other thing was I used to spend a lot of time role playing. I used to play a lot, either with friends or on my own, playing teachers, playing shopkeepers, writing things out, looking through catalogues, pretending to take orders on the phone. So I think I honestly was very interested and very naturally interested. I just found those things very easy to do.
Oh, that's lovely. I think it's kind of clear to see you started on your career path quite early in life in that case.
Yes, I did.
Acting out role plays as teachers, and writing those holiday diaries. That's really nice. Martin, same question to you, please.
Well, I was the exact opposite of Jill, I suppose, in many ways. We're living up to the stereotypes here, but as a child at primary school, I was much more into the maths, the science, the history, the technology. And whilst I enjoyed reading as a child, certainly writing as a primary age pupil was not something I was interested in at all. I really did see that as like doing work, and the idea of writing for pleasure, that would have never crossed my mind in the slightest as a primary age child. But I remember sort of starting secondary school, and would probably be maybe the equivalent of what's now year 7, year 8 in secondary school. And you have those experiences where the local press hand over like a page of their newspaper to a school and invite people to write an article. And that's one of the first times I can really remember sort of being inspired to write, because suddenly, we were allowed to choose the topic about what we were writing. So I'm a big sports fan, particularly football. So, I wrote an article about a local football team, and I was, delighted when, my article was one of about sort of, 6 or 8 I was choosing from the class to be published. And I think that idea of suddenly like you're writing for an audience, it's not just writing for school and for the purpose of the class teacher.
I think that's a really interesting, hearing both of you answer that same question really highlights for me, in the classroom as a teacher, you're dealing with lots of different children who have different motivations, different interests. And it's trying to find, as you say, Martin, that one thing that they can hook onto and get excited and enthused about. I couldn't have asked for a better answer to that question because it brings that to life so beautifully. We're going to move on to today's main questions. We've taken insights from the Cambridge panel to inform the questions we're going to ask you both today. And we're going to start off with a question which nicely encapsulates our key themes. What teaching techniques help to bring the curriculum to life and encourage learners to use their imagination to develop key skills such as reading and writing? There is a variety of different techniques we could touch upon in this question, from active learning to using technology in the classroom. Mariam from the Cambridge panel, who's based in Egypt, has also asked about the effectiveness of 5-sense stimulation. This technique encourages the use of various stimuli, from listening to music to using visual prompts to inspire and support learners. Thank you, Mariam, for this suggestion. It'd be great to delve into this discussion around different teaching techniques which help to bring the curriculum to life. Martin, I'd like to start with you this time, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So the strapline of Animate, Educate is bringing the curriculum to life, and I'm a firm believer that we do have to get children hooked into the theme, the topic, the book, whatever it is that they are studying, in order to inspire them and make them want to write. And I think once children are immersed in an activity, once children are immersed in a topic, then suddenly the creativity comes flowing, the writing can come sort of from that. So for me, I particularly love things like virtual reality, augmented reality now, that sort of allow children as near as possible experiences that we wouldn't otherwise be able to give them. I think sort of, in 2020, that's ever more sort of key, when we can't physically necessarily take children on school trips and visits and everything else. But, imagine you're doing something like dinosaurs, polar bears, whatever it might be. It's impossible for children to travel back in time to sort of see these things. But if we can have sort of like a dinosaur sort of in augmented reality, walking across the classroom, a polar bear in the hand, whatever it might be, then the language that comes out of that, and describing sort of the features that make it suited to its habitat, etc., are going to be far greater than if you just look at a picture on a page in a book, or watch a video, sort of, for example. We use a product at Lanchester in my workshops around the country called Now Press Play, which is like an immersive set of headphones that enable children to have a 20-25 minute sort of experience, where they might, for example, relive what it was like sort of in the Blitz and going into the Anderson shelters and so on. And I think children need to, have a physical experience, because that very much sort of leads into language. If that stereotypical just giving child a blank sheet of paper, they're not going to be able to write. They need as much sort of stimulus as possible. And, we might not be able to invoke the sense of smell too much, but I think sort of the sense of, of touch, of hearing, of everything else, anything we can do will really sort of, hook children, and, great writing and great learning will come from it. I think communication is key as well. I mentioned sort of about my own experience as a child, that until there was like an audience for the work, I didn't really want to write. And nowadays, I'm very passionate about that still, because too much of children's work does have an audience of one. The class teacher, it ends up just in the tray in the classroom. There's no way for it to be viewed. But if you think about the digital communication we've got now, particularly like sort of social media platforms, then children can instantly sort of be sharing their work with a real worldwide audience, and you can get children hooked in a way that was never possible sort of when I was a child. We regularly have like authors being part of our lessons now, because we'll simply tweet the child's bit of work, or we'll tweet a question, and the author of a book will suddenly become part of that lesson for the week. We've had athletes and like astronauts. Like one of the standout one I remember is when Tim Peake was on board the International Space Station, and we did a bit of writing about that, and Tim Peake was replying from the International Space Station to our people. How much of like an amazing hook is that sort of to get children into writing. And often present around the theme of let's get phygital, of combining the physical and the digital. Thankfully I don't dress up like Olivia Newton-John and me like going that for it, but very much like that idea, because often there's this like stereotype that the digital almost works against the physical. We often talk about how children are just sat in front of the games consoles at home, they're not getting out and about. But actually, if we use sort of digital technology correctly, it can sort of really inspire writing through getting children phygital. We've spoke about augmented reality, virtual reality. So, things like if I'm doing a bit of like superhero writing, for example, then I'll use something like augmented reality, and suddenly the children will have superpowers. But if they're acting that out, then that language comes into their writing, because they'll talk about like, similes and metaphors as to how their superpowers are working and everything else. Something like green screen technology, again, getting the children to sort of act things out. It's this idea of sort of like read, write, perform that, people talk about in schools. We often do the reading and the writing, but we don't give children the opportunity to perform their work, and again, to sort of share it out there in that. So, I think if we combine all the technology that's available now, not sort of, overloading the curriculum with it, but using it at the right times to give that hook, to give that stimulus, to give that, end product, and, writing for a real sort of purpose, then it can bring, amazing benefits to the writing of pupils. And those reluctant pupils, like what I was like as a child, are gone, because that hook, that stimulus comes at a far earlier age now.
Thanks, Martin. I think that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, certainly I see with my own children that they are naturally curious, and it's finding a way to spark that curiosity and build that, and to kind of really engage them and hook them in. And I can imagine that can be quite challenging in a classroom situation when you've got many pupils. Gill, as a researcher and writer specialising in early years education, what does bringing the curriculum to life mean in terms of early years education and young learners?
Following on beautifully, really, from what Martin's been talking about, and I absolutely love the idea of Phygital, because I think that's what we're all aiming for, this combination. It's really a misunderstanding to think that technology is about just sitting there and being passive. It absolutely is not, when it's done as brilliantly as I know Martin does it. And also, just to pick up on something else Martin was talking about, is Now Press Play, which I've also used and seen in use. And I love it because it brings in the audio. A lot of digital stuff doesn't necessarily do that. And I think the power of oracy from the very beginning is huge. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in response to questions. But I think Now Press Play is just fantastic, because the children are listening, they're responding physically. I think it's hugely powerful. Early years teachers are so expert at harnessing children's natural interests and curiosity, learning to let it go and intervene and facilitate at the right point in time to really capture the best and exploit in the best possible way the opportunity that the children themselves are often creating. And I'm also minded of the famous quote, "Tell me and I will forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I will understand." And I know we've used that a lot in education over the years, but it is true. It is so important to involve particularly very young children in their learning. Some of my favourite recollections in early years are things like the mud kitchen. A mud kitchen isn't just about letting children go out and make a mess and talk to friends and have fun, although, yes, all those things are happening. But in itself, it is an environment. And in fact, only today I was reading an article about this, where how the mud kitchen is constructed, if it's constructed on a level or at the top of a slight slope, or it has cabinets within it where things are stored at different heights. If there's a little writing corner within the mud kitchen, they might be wanting to write their recipes down. These are the things where we're seamlessly weaving oracy and reading and writing. And there's just two other things which actually aren't early years that I really wanted to mention. There's somebody on Twitter called Johnny Walker. He's at @JohnnyWalker_edu, who actually takes disadvantaged learners away into the forest as a poetry retreat. And he manages to inspire the children, or perhaps the nature inspires the children to write. And he doesn't make it explicit. He just takes the children. It's an environment where they feel relaxed. They can share what they want to share or not. They can write what they want to write or not. And even at the end of the session, sometimes I know he inspires the children to write something for themselves to help them to understand, really, that writing doesn't always have to be for an audience. Actually, sometimes it can be for yourself, to help with your own peace of mind. So that's really inspirational.
Excellent. Thanks, Gill. It's really interesting to hear you talk about, how just by something simple as being in the mud kitchen and playing and learning and developing, that students, young learners, they're getting to grips with language, and they're also developing their motor skills, which, as you know, as much better than I, is really important for good handwriting. And I think sometimes there is a danger that teachers possibly find that sort of learning a challenge. They find it, they can't say to parents, well, your child has learned this, this and this today, because there's no explicit output. And I wonder if sometimes that can be quite difficult as a teacher to feel that you've got that freedom in the classroom, and you can let a learner develop, explore, do what they want to do, and understand that actually that's just as valuable as more formalized kind of learning. Now I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into this topic of key skills development. Michael, who is based in Ghana and teaches primary, has written in on the Cambridge panel asking about the interrelation between speaking and writing. I'd like to ask you both, how does the development of reading, writing and speaking skills for primary learners interrelate? So Gill, if you could start us off this time.
It's really incomprehensible for me to consider that anyone might think that aspects of literacy are discrete. They are fundamentally intertwined. So it's quite hard to know where to start with this question, really. But anyway, I've decided to start with talking about reading for pleasure, because from the earliest possible age, even babies, as we know, are capable of enjoying words and sounds and pictures. And so this idea of reading for pleasure, sharing books, loving stories, loving information, finding out things is absolutely critical for our young learners. There are lots of people I follow and I would love to recommend. At Teresa Kremen is one of them, at openuni_RFP, as in reading for pleasure. At Nikki Gamble, at the wonderful Imagine Story Centre. These are people who spend day in and day out looking for wonderful books to inspire children. And my own particular interest is picture books and wordless books, because I think whatever the age, these are books that enable you to talk, to share, to read. You can read the pictures, that's a real skill, and then to write your own words for the pictures. So they really open up fantastic opportunities. But it is absolutely critical that we give children the tools to enable them to both decode for reading and encode for spelling and writing. And the two go together like two sides of a coin. So obviously those are also interdependent. And I've left speaking and listening for my last point, but not because it's less important by any means. It's actually something we find very difficult, I think, to sometimes teach in a structured way and also to record. I recently came across a charity called Voice 21, which provides a really useful framework for oracy development, which I've become very interested in. And they've recently run something called Oracy October, where there were tens of fantastic free online workshops to explore this idea of oracy development. So I would recommend having a look at that. I would also say, apart from the obvious thing about children speaking and listening to each other and to sharing ideas and developing, I think oral feedback is a critical element of effective formative assessment. And I was recently listening to James Clements. He's at Mr. J. Clements, and he was talking about his experience in school of a feedback funnel. And I love this idea that you start with something very broad, like proofreading independently, and then you might do an oral feedback on some of the small things in the piece of work, then perhaps doing some peer working where you're focusing on some secretarial aspects of their work, becoming more and more refined, then perhaps giving them some quality written feedback as the teacher to the learner, and then finally giving the learners chance to go back and improve their writing. And I love the way that this includes the oracy into writing and then ultimately rereading your own work. And I think for me, that's a perfect example of how these skills interrelate.
Excellent. Thank you, Jo. I love the idea of that feedback funnel. I think it sounds brilliant.
I do too. Yeah.
Martin, do you have any insights to add on how technology can support all different learners in a variety of ways as they develop these skills?
Yeah, well, firstly, I completely agree with everything Gill was saying about how the skills do very much interlink. But thinking and just following on a little bit from a technology point of view, so there's no doubt that reading plays a major role in the development of writing, and probably if we go back about 5 years ago, I think lots of people thought that like digital ebooks were going to almost sort of take over in education and, would be everywhere. And that hasn't really happened. It's still a very underused resource. And, I'm beginning to wonder now as we look to the next 5 to 10 years whether it ever will really be sort of utilised and used in the way that people maybe previously thought. And children sort of do learn things from, what they read. If they haven't had that sort of experience of reading adventure stories, then they're not going to be able to write an adventure story of their own. So it's really important that through whatever medium it is, whether it be through a physical book, a digital book, whatever, that we make sure that children have the experience of reading, that they can then apply the work and the skills of those authors into their own work. But when we're thinking about sort of, reading resources, it's not just as a text stimulation. It's not just like, oh, will children respond better to a digital book than a physical book? I think we've particularly got to think about maybe like SEND children. I think this is where digital resources have had more of an impact, in recent years, because that easy ability to change the size of a text on a digital book is an absolute invaluable resource. We can change background colours and stuff like that to make them more accessible to dyslexic learners. And these things are not just about making the curriculum accessible for a few, they're about making the curriculum accessible for all. And actually, these are little skills that we shouldn't just focus on child A and B, but actually enlarging the text, looking for all people's, what background colours do they pick up on best, and that I think we often leave it too late in sort of a child's development before we pick up on these things, rather than giving individual children, individual teachers, the ability to have a large sort of piece of text. I'm looking now, like I've made some notes for this session. I've got them on my iPad next to me, but I've blown them up to like a 20-point font and stuff like that, so that I can easily sort of see them. And things like that are sort of pivotal and easy to use tools that we are completely sort of underused and underutilized in the classroom for the moment. Jill spoke about speaking and listening skills, and obviously this is where technology can play a major sort of benefit and can give a real sort of purpose and output to what children are producing in writing. So, I love audio recording apps, and there's a million and one out there. And obviously my particular love of animation sort of really lends itself to that, because suddenly those characters in a book that children are studying, those characters they've created, a historical figure that they're looking at, for example, you can suddenly give them a voice. So I remember working with the school in the Midlands just before the summer holidays, and, they were looking at the Titanic as a topic. So we looked at Captain Smith, who was the captain on board the Titanic. We used an app called Morphobooth to bring Captain Smith to life. And the children had to give a voice to the captain and think about, what would he been saying to the crew in those moments after the Titanic struck the iceberg until it sunk. So, something like that, when there's suddenly the characters and animation, it's much easier for children to develop a voice, to think about the words that somebody would be saying when something is physically happening. There's that movement, and just, right then in your exercise books, what Captain Smith would have said, it changes the dynamic of everything. I'll look back to when I first started teaching. I often used to use a puppet, because I used to find that certain children in the class would talk to the puppet, but they would never speak to me, or they would never talk as part of a group. And what I've actually found in recent years, quite surprisingly in some ways, is that those same children will often speak to a digital device. They'll not share their ideas in a group. They'll not speak to the teacher. But actually, if they're in their own little world, they're quite happy sort of speaking and audio recording. And sometimes, particularly with like early years children, I've gone into a classroom, I've played something back on the iPad, and the teacher then the days went, is that little Jessica? I've never heard Jessica speak before, So suddenly these devices, these tools can give a voice to children that are almost like sort of mute in the classroom. And obviously, I think, spoken English at all levels does come before written English. So if we think about English as an additional language, for example, then it's even more important that we use, any audio recording device. We use animation, etc., in terms of on the device, because the more opportunities we can give children to practice the spoken English, then the written English can come. But if they're used to using the devices, then the natural next step is using things like voice to text. And, that again now is not so much tomorrow's worldy as what it used to be, because we're using things like Siri and Alexa and stuff like that in our home. So for teachers to embrace that technology, it hopefully feels a little bit more natural now. We've sort of experimented at a teacher level, sort of trying to use voice to text a little bit more now for emails and messages. We wrote our reports sort of in the summer using voice to text, and it suddenly made the reports far more personal. We got, far more sort of time saving out of it. So I think if teachers use things professionally, then the next step is like they've got the confidence to sort of to use it in the classroom, and then it sort of builds up the children being able to independently write. So from voice recording to voice to text to actually them themselves sort of independently entering text. And obviously you've got things like translation facilities, you've got sort of predictive text and stuff like that that can help children to develop the writing experience too.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. I think it's really interesting you kind of picking up on technology's ability to almost kind of level the playing field and to introduce learners that might previously have not engaged with an activity, or who might have found it really challenging to get involved, and to help them kind of bring their voice into the classroom. I think that's really valuable. We're almost coming to the end of today's episode, but before we do, I'd like to spend some time thinking about the future and potential further impacts and influence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Martin, in what ways do you think the recent home learning experience will influence primary education in the future?
To some extent, only time's going to tell. It's probably a little bit too early at the moment to make that prediction, but there's no doubt that 2020 has brought about some element of change. I think lots of schools that were maybe reluctant to use and to embrace technology have been forced, for want of a better word, down that route in recent months. And I've spoke a lot that I think in many ways we've had like 6 years worth of CPD in the last 6 months in terms of how we've sort of developed the use of technology. And what would have taken ages to be implemented through staff meetings, etc. Staff have had no choice but to have a go, and ultimately, like everything in life, that is how we learn. So hopefully a lot of as what have been implemented in recent weeks and months will carry forward and will start to make a difference, because technology does enable us to take a blended approach to learning, where we combine sort of face-to-face sessions with the best of online learning. And as we speak today, like our year 2 bubble at Lanchester, my school in County Durham, went down on Friday, so we've had to instantly flip to online learning for today, and actually that's now 50% of our Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 pupils have now had to have a period of self-isolation and to access online learning. I think it's pivotal that we do have really good and productive online learning in place, and there's no doubt about it that it's differing greatly from school to school around the country sort of at the moment. So what we've tried to do, we've combined sort of Zoom for an element of live teaching, so we're going online sort of 3 times a day at 9:15, 11:15 and 1:15 to give that introduction still to the start of each lesson, to model something like writing, for example, like what we've been talking about. But it also gives a bit of structure to the day still, because one of the things that we reflected back on in spring and summer was that when we were just putting things online for pupils and parents to access, a lot of it was just maybe before 11 o'clock in the morning. So it was almost like a bit of a token gesture, sort of children accessing online learning. So I think, it's important for the pupils, but particularly for parents who are maybe trying to work from home online, that we give that structure to the day, but also there is that live element of support there. So we introduced the lessons through Zoom. We use something called eSchools, which is our learning platform, which then sort of work is shared onto. But also the thing that we addressed, we had an inset day at the start of September on blended learning around how we wanted to develop our online learning policy for 2020-21, was that we decided that we must sort of now still give people's feedback and comments on their work. And again, that was something that wasn't necessarily happening in the summer term. It was almost like it's a bonus if they access the work. It was down to the parents to support them. So we're making use of the technology there. So again, through eSchools, pupils can upload their work, teachers can comment on it, and then it gets resubmitted back to the pupils. But also we're making use of that new technology again. So things like audio recording that I've mentioned earlier in the podcast. So through the likes of Purple Mash, which we use a lot for issuing work to children getting back, you can audio record the feedback. So a couple of weeks ago, when our year 5s were in self-isolation, I was doing a lesson with around sort of 60 of them online. It would have taken me a long time to give written feedback on 60 bits of work, and it would have probably been lost, because by the time they looked at it, the lesson would have gone. But by using audio recording, the children were submitting their work to me. It was coming in, and I was then reading it, but using audio recording to suggest improvements, it was going straight back to the children, and then I would sort of see their work that reflected upon my comments and so on. So it's important that these little changes we take on board, we develop, but actually they can have long-term impact. So in terms of, we often complain about teacher workload and so on, but it's important that we give feedback to children, but nobody's ever said that feedback has to be written. So moving forward, through use of QR codes and stuff like that we can give audio feedback, video feedback, it can have a real sort of benefit moving forward. And we often hear about like this like approach like called flipped learning, where often like the learning about the topic, for example, has been done in advance. So you might share some video content, some reading, and children come into the classroom having had that sort of pre-knowledge already. So I am a firm believer that the term teacher to some extent should go out the window, because it almost implies that we are this like fountain of all knowledge that children must listen to for 15-20 minutes, absorb everything straight away, and then get on and produce some work. Where the term facilitator of learning, I'm not sort of saying it's ever going to be embraced as like, oh yes, I'm a facilitator and learning as a job, but I think we should view our role in that way. It's not to like sort of just provide children with all the knowledge, but it's to facilitate the learning experience that might have actually happened through watching some videos in advance, or we actually sort of record the content, which we're doing a lot more now online. And everyone learns at their own pace. So in the classroom, maybe we do need to give children like a tablet that has, whether it be our slide deck or a video on it, and they can go back, that rewind it and pause it and look back over things. And, these are things that I, sincerely hope that in the coming years, will happen, will transform and develop the classroom. And, whilst COVID's obviously been horrendous in many ways, it might actually, finally be the stimulus that makes that happen. And possibly most importantly, from a child point of view, I think what it's done, particularly at a primary level, is that it has made children more independent learners. I think we'd maybe had a generation where children needed to be spoon-fed a little bit too much, whether it be by the teacher, by the parents at home. But now, because children are having to access online content at the same time as maybe parents are at home working from home as well, I think children are developing that little bit more independence of managing their school day, managing their work and so on, that maybe, didn't come about to secondary education previously. And in terms of the physical devices themselves, I think for many years, parents have bought laptops, tablets, etc. And they'll go, I bought them to do their homework on. Well, actually, maybe in 2020 for the first time, we're actually seeing that devices are being bought, and that actually the primary function of that device is, in order to, enable learning from home to take place. So it's going to be interesting quite clearly into 2021. This is still going to continue, and I'll look with interest as to what the future beyond that will hold. And I hope that whilst we can return back to much more face-to-face learning, that, we'll not just forget everything that we've learned and developed throughout 2020-21.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. And Gill, same question to you, please.
What Martin was saying there really resonated with me, particularly. I love the way you link back there to the idea of feedback and how important technology can be, in that sphere. I think that's a huge area, really interesting area, and so critical for ensuring consistency of teaching and learning. I'm also really interested in this idea that what this period of the pandemic has done and is doing is really showing up the gap between those schools who've engaged with technology or not. And even in my own experience, I've got one primary school that was really not very well equipped to cope with a pandemic. I mean, let's face it, probably none of us were really well equipped, but, from a technological point of view, they didn't really have systems in place. They've had to really learn on their feet super quickly at a very difficult time. And I think that's put huge pressure on particularly on that school, who were having other sorts of challenges at the same time. And my experience there was that they quickly got to grips with Zoom, and they were running weekly whole school assemblies where there was a platform for us all to go on and to talk about what each class was doing, and for children to share their work. And often you could see parents were sat with their children at home, and it was a really effective, fast learning situation for that school. Now, for many schools, like the sort of school where Martin works, and other schools where Martin works, you can see that would be an absolute kind of basic provision. But that's where many schools are. Probably even now, that's where many schools are. They're really just coming to terms with learning technology for those very basic things. And also for admin. Many schools are using technology for the running of the school very effectively. And we want it not just to be about admin. We want it to be, as Martin has wonderfully described, about teaching and learning. Whereas my secondary school in my MAT is a Google school. So, all the students have their devices. They're familiar with logging on and accessing work and challenges. online and exchanging their work. So I had two really contrasting situations, one that was really at the beginning of its tech journey, if you like, and one that is very proficient. And actually that secondary school also helping the primaries within the MAT. So that's been really interesting for me to see how those different schools are engaging. I think the other thing I've noticed is that obviously it's also highlighted the differences for home provision. So, many families might be sharing a smartphone, and if mum and dad are working at home, or one parent is working at home and the child is trying to access something using the phone, that's really putting pressure on everybody in the home environment at what's a very difficult time. So I know the government has talked about making devices available for those disadvantaged families, and we look forward to that really coming on stream and strengthening, let's hope, over the months to come. But I think these disparities are bound to affect the response children can make to work that's been set at home. We also know, of course, that the government have recently announced that learning, if schools close or year groups close, learning must be immediately available online. And again, I think that will have thrown a lot of schools into panic, quite frankly. But I think it's important to have both online and to have go-home packs ready work for children to pick up at home. So I really think searching for the free quality resources and making sure parents are aware of those is a really, really important thing. In the short term response to the pandemic, I think there are a couple of things that we really need to bear in mind. I think time is critical. We can't all be online all the time. We can't be communicating with those families all the time if they're at home. So I think making sure that we use time to the best possible effect is so important. Whether it's face-to-face learning or whether it's online, we have to really make sure that time is well spent, because it's very precious at the moment. I think children probably are struggling a bit with concentration and stamina because they've been out of school, then they're in school, then perhaps some of them are being sent home again because there's a flare-up somewhere. And I think just having a concentrated period of time where they can look at what they're supposed to be doing, and they're not with their friends and they're not necessarily with their teacher. So I think being a little bit aware of maybe shorter, snappier activities for this period of time is probably really important. I think also they'll be out of the way of talking in a schooly way, not really using the language of school, but more the language of home. And it's an opportunity to reflect on what those differences are, but they are quite different, and rightly so. But I think some children, when they come back to school, may have forgotten about that context, that school context for the language and the specialist terms we use when we're doing maths or English or reading or whatever. And a little plug for handwriting here, because as you mentioned at the beginning, Emma, obviously I'm the author of Pen Pals for Handwriting. Actually, transcription, whilst you're based at home, is probably a little bit difficult, particularly as Martin was saying at the beginning, if you're somebody that doesn't think about writing for pleasure. Handwriting can be a fantastic take-home activity, and it's a really good physical activity to practice, and relatively easy for parents to monitor and for children to deliver on. So I do think actually transcription in the form of handwriting is probably a really useful one. And finally, longer term, what the impact might be. Well, I think all schools, let's hope, as Martin was saying, will be smarter and more prepared. Already they are, or we are, I should say. But overall, I hope that there's a better sense of blending and a better sense of balance. That's what I really hope comes out of this. That, as in my school that was less well prepared, let's hope that school now will be better prepared in the future. And I think that gives us real hope. I think planning for the unexpected and retaining the high quality focused teaching and learning with effective assessment and evidence of impact has always got to be our focus. It doesn't matter if there's a pandemic or not. That is what we're in school to do, or out of school trying to do. And so I think that's the challenge, whatever the means of delivery. I think that's our challenge, to ensure that as far as possible we can maintain this very high quality of teaching and learning. So yeah, let's hope.
Excellent. Thanks to you both. There were some really interesting insights that came through in both of your answers. And I think one of the main things I've taken away from this, one of the few positives of this situation, is that it's almost, although it's a really challenging time for teachers, for learners and for parents, it's getting parents more engaged in their child's learning. Like, you have to get engaged. I know when mine come home from school, I'd say, "How was your day? It was good. What did you do? Don't know, can't remember." But when they're actually sat next to you, you can physically see what they're doing. You can get involved and you can understand where they're at. And that for me has been one of the nicer things of the situation. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I'm just going to wrap up and say thank you again to both Gill and Martin for joining us in our virtual studio. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. I hope our listeners will take away some great ideas. Just before we kind of close off, if our listeners want to find out more about either Gill, yourself, or you, Martin, where can they find you? Do you have a Twitter handle or anything like that they can go and find? Martin, to you first.
To me first. So yes, on Twitter I am at Animate2Educate. So that's a number 2 and at Animate2Educate, or my website www.animate2educate.co.uk. I've spoke a lot about my own school, Lanchester E.P. We're a big tweeting school too, and again on Twitter just at Lanchester EP. So I think Manchester would swap the M for an L, at Lanchester EP. So you'll find either myself or my school on Twitter, and my website animateeducate.co.uk.
And Gill?
Yes, I'm on Twitter as well. I'm at Gill Budgell, all lowercase, and my website, although under development, is www.fratempo.co.uk. So yeah, very happy to be in contact with anybody that has follow-up questions.
Thank you to our panellists for steering our discussion today. We had some really interesting comments from them that sparked our conversation. We'd love to hear from you as well. You can follow on Twitter at CEP Education and ask your questions or suggest ideas for future episodes. Don't forget to use the hashtag BrighterPod to share your thoughts on today's episode. We've included lots of useful links in the show notes, including the Fratempo website, the Animate to Educate website, and many more. If you're listening through iTunes, please do leave us a review. We love hearing your feedback. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to Gill and Martin. It's goodbye for now, but please do join us next time on the Brighter Thinking Pod.